They said wild horses belonged only to the mountains, untamed, unreachable, as if carved from the wind itself. Yet, on a blistering summer afternoon in Jackson Hole, the ordinary fractured. A little girl tugged at her mother's hand, her voice barely louder than the cicadas humming in the pines. "Mom," Lily whispered, eyes wide as if she'd seen a miracle. "Can I buy that horse?" Clare Dawson, the ranger who had braved blizzards, buried friends, and stared down the wild more times than she cared to count, turned with the calm patience of habit, only to stop cold. What stood tethered at the corner of Main Street was no carriage horse, no broken mare for tourists to gawk at. It was a stallion, black as midnight, ribs showing through its hide, scarred like it had fought the mountain itself. Its eyes burned, not with fear, but with defiance, an untamed fire that refused to die. Claire's breath caught. In that instant, the valley seemed to hush, as if even the Tetons themselves leaned closer to watch. She couldn't know it yet, but her daughter's question had pulled at a thread woven deep into the valley's shadowed history, a thread that, once unraveled, would drag them both into secrets meant to stay buried. The summer sun poured gold across Jackson Hole, painting Main Street with a deceptive warmth. Tourists laughed, children darted past souvenir shops, carriage bells jingled like echoes of the Old West. But above it all, the mountains loomed stern, jagged, merciless, reminding every soul who lived here that beauty always carried a price. Claire walked with her ranger's stride, khaki sleeves rolled high, eyes scanning instinctively, even off-duty. At 32, grief had etched itself into her bones, carved by the climbing accident that stole her husband 2 years earlier. Duty had become her refuge, silence her companion. Only Lily's hand in hers, warm, fragile, alive, kept her tethered to something more than loss. And now, Lily was staring at the stallion, as if fate itself had stepped out of the wilderness and onto Main Street. Claire opened her mouth, ready to dismiss it with a tired smile. But then, the horse jerked against the rope, nostrils flaring, muscles rippling with a violence that made the crowd stumble back. Its gaze locked on Claire, unblinking, unyielding. For a heartbeat, she swore the beast recognized her. The rope frayed, the crowd gasped, and before Claire could move, before Lily's small fingers tightened in hers, the stallion lunged straight toward them. "Look, Mom," she exclaimed, tugging at her arm as they passed a window stacked with cowboy boots. "That pair has stars on it. Can I try them on?" Claire gave, her a sidelong glance, lips twitching in something close to a smile. "Boots are for walking, not shining like a parade. You'd ruin them in a week," Lily giggled, unconcerned, and skipped ahead half a step. There was something of her father in her, his soft heart, his awe for living things. Claire saw it most in the way Lily crouched to stroke stray cats or whispered to sparrows on the fence line. Sometimes it made Claire ache, seeing the reflection of a man she had lost. Sometimes it made her afraid. Compassion in this world was too easily bruised. The street curved past the grocery store and the shuttered bookstore, where dust filmed the windows. That was when Claire noticed the figure slouched near the bus stop. At first glance, he looked like a man discarded by life. His name would come back to her later. Harlan Briggs, the drifter, once mentioned in a complaint for loitering. He sat hunched against a leaning post, his beard ragged and streaked with gray, his plaid shirt stained and torn boots collapsing at the heels. A sour whiff of liquor drifted even from across the street. His eyes flicked back and forth, quick and unsettled, like a man always scanning for danger or opportunity. But it wasn't the man who made Lily stop so abruptly that Claire nearly stumbled into her. It was what lay beside him. Tethered by a fraying rope half sprawled on the ground was the largest horse Claire had ever seen outside of two. Draft stock. A stallion black as midnight, though his coat had dulled with grime and hunger. His ribs showed faintly beneath the matted hair, his flanks hollow. A back leg trembled when he shifted stiff from an old injury that had never healed right. His ears, one bent oddly at the tip, flicked listlessly. Yet his presence was impossible to ignore. He wasn't broken, not truly. Even in his ruin, he held himself with an echo of majesty. His head lifted slightly when Lily stopped, and his dark eyes so deep they seemed almost human met hers. They were the eyes of something battered, nearly to death, yet still unwilling to surrender. Propped against Harlan's knee was a battered piece of cardboard, scrolled in Margar $5 for the beast. Claire felt her stomach knot. Beside her, Lily's hand tightened on her fingers. Her voice dropped to a whisper, trembling but certain. "Mom, can I buy him?" Claire turned sharply. "What? Please." Lily's eyes were wide gray like her mother's, but stripped of all her heaviness. "Look at him." Claire forced herself to. She saw the jutting bones, the dull coat, the limp leg. She had seen neglected animals before, and her work had even put down a few whose suffering was beyond repair. She told herself this was no different. The rationale part of her bristled at the thought of bringing such a burden home. He could be dangerous, she said, softly. We don't know his history, and we already have enough to handle. But Lily wasn't listening. She crouched right there on the sidewalk, her dress brushing dust, and stared into the stallion's eyes. The horse lifted his head, nostrils flaring, meeting her gaze with a quiet intensity. For a moment, the noise of the street seemed to fade. The honking cars, the murmur of voices, even the weight of the sun. All that existed was a battered child of the wild, and a child who refused to look away. Lily whispered, "Please, Mom, he needs us. We can't just leave him." Claw's jaw tightened. She glanced at her own, who smirked. $5, Ranger, that's all it takes. He ain't worth more than that anyway." The casual cruelty in his tone made Claire's blood heat. To speak of a living creature as if it were a rusty tool to be pawned. Her hand drifted unconsciously toward her wallet, then froze. She couldn't, she shouldn't, but Lily's fingers clutched her own, small and insistent, and the thought of walking away from those dark eyes that mirrored wounds too, familiar, felt unbearable. With a slow breath, Claire pulled a $5 bill from her pocket. "Fine," she muttered, handing it over. "But he's your responsibility, Lily." Her daughter's face lit brighter than the sun overhead. She sprang up, flung her arms around Claire's waist. "Thank you, Mom, thank you." Harlan snatched the bill, stuffed it into his pocket, and muttered, "Please doing business." He slung his filthy backpack over one shoulder and shuffled down the street with surprising speed. He didn't look back. It was as if the instant money touched his hand. He wanted nothing more to do with the creature he had abandoned. Claire frowned, unsettled by his haste. People usually lingered, tried to haggle, tried to squeeze a few more dollars, but Harlan vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the echo of his cruel sign. Meanwhile, Lily had dropped to her knees again, stroking the stallion's tangled mane with infinite care. "We'll take care of you now," she whispered. "You're safe." The horse gave the faintest wag of his tail, almost imperceptible. His tongue lolled slightly, and from his throat came a sound half sigh, half whimper, fragile but alive. "What should we call him?" Lily asked, glancing up at Claire, eyes brimming with hope. Claire crouched beside her. Up close, she saw more clearly the scars, the puckered line around his neck, the healed fracture in his leg, the faint whip marks across his flank. The sight made something old and painful stir inside her, the same ache that rose whenever she thought of those she hadn't been able to save. "We'll think of something," she said, gently, brushing a hand across his head. The coarse hair prickled her palm, but beneath it, she felt the tremor of life, steady and waiting. Lily hugged the horse's neck carefully. "You're ours now. Don't worry, we won't let you go." Claire looked at her daughter, then at the animal, and wondered just for a fleeting second if this choice would change more than just the fate of one battered stallion. There was something in the way he looked back at Lily as if recognizing her. The thought unsettled and comforted her at once. The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of pine and the far-off rumble of a train. Evening shadows stretched longer across Main Street. Claire rose, adjusting her stance, eyes still on the road where Harlan had disappeared. The man was gone without a trace, swallowed by the crowd. She exhaled, slowly. Beside her, Lily pressed her cheek against the horse's scarred shoulder, smiling through tears. And for a moment, Claire felt the shift, the fragile beginning of something neither of them could yet name. The stallion stood silent, but unyielding like a sentinel. His shadow stretched across the dust at their feet, and in that shadow, Claire knew their lives had already changed forever. The next morning broke soft and pale over the valley. Sunlight spilled across the peaks, catching the last of the dew before it vanished into the warming air. Jackson Hole stirred awake with the sounds of trucks rolling down the highway and a hawk circling above the treine, its cry, sharp and distant. At the Dawson home on the town's edge, the day began with a quieter rhythm. Claire stepped onto the back porch coffee, mug in hand, and felt the cool dampness of the grass beneath her boots. The small barn that squatted behind the house hadn't been used in years. The roof panels of tin were rusting, and the paint had peeled from the boards, but the structure still stood waiting, perhaps for its purpose to return. She watched as her daughter darted across the yard, clutching a bucket almost as large as her torso. Lily's hair had already escaped the neat braid Clare had tied earlier, strands glowing in the sunlight as she skipped. In the bucket rattled a brush, a bottle of old horse shampoo, and a ragged sponge. "Slow down," Clare called, suppressing a smile. "You'll spill half of it before we even get started." "I'm careful," Lily protested. Though she nearly tripped on the porch step, she beamed anyway, her enthusiasm unshaken. Behind them, tethered loosely to a fence, a post, the black stallion stood with his head high and ears flicking. He hadn't made a sound since arriving the night before, not even a protest, when Clare had led him to water. Now, in the morning light, the scale of him seemed even greater. His coat, though, dulled, caught gleams of blue-black where the sun touched it. His legs were thick, his chest broad, his entire frame a testament to what he must once have been before neglect had wasted him. Yet, his eyes were not docile. They roved sharp and suspicious, pausing on every noise, the clatter of Lily's bucket, the barking of a neighbor's dog, the slam of a distant truck door. He stood like a soldier on foreign ground, cautious, waiting to decide whether the ones near him were friend or foe. Clare set her mug aside and slipped on a pair of worn gloves. "All right," she murmured, approaching with measured steps. "Let's see what you've been carrying." The stallion shifted slightly weight, rolling off his bad leg. His ears flicked back at her presence, then forward again. He didn't rear or pull, didn't bare his teeth. He only stood still as stone, as though testing her intentions. "It's okay," Lily whispered, edging closer. She had no gloves, only a child's faith, and reached out with her small hand to stroke his mane. "We're not going to hurt you." The horse lowered his head an inch enough to let the child's fingers brush over the tangled hair. Clare exhaled slowly. Trust, fragile as glass, had taken its first route. They began with the brush. Layers of dust, sweat, and dried mud flaked away as Clare worked, the coarse bristles down his flank. The more she cleaned, the more the truth revealed itself. Not just dirt, but history written into skin. Her eyes caught the first mark on his neck, a deep groove, hairless and puckered, circling as if some iron collar had burned into him. She froze bristles, pausing mid-stroke. The scar wasn't from nature. It was made by human hands. Moving lower, she found parallel ridges across his side, thin and straight like lines carved by a whip. Some healed long ago, others newer, raised still with anger beneath the skin. When she reached his hind leg, her hand traced the subtle but undeniable curve where bone had once broken. It had healed, but not properly, leaving the limb slightly twisted. No wonder his stride faltered. Lily crouched on the other side, had fallen silent. Her little hand hovered over the marks. "Mom," she whispered, voice trembling. "Who did this to him?" Clare swallowed. Heat flared in her chest, a tide of fury and helplessness. She wanted to say the truth, that men had done this, men who saw strength only as profit and suffering as irrelevant. But her daughter's eyes were too wide, too innocent. She forced the anger back, shook her head. "Some people shouldn't be allowed near animals. That's all you need to know." Lily's lip trembled, but she nodded. She leaned forward and pressed her cheek gently against the stallion's shoulder, careful not to touch the worst scars. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the dark coat. "I'm so sorry." The horse stood still, eyes half closed, as if receiving something he hadn't been offered in a long time. Apology. By midday, the worst of the grime had been scrubbed away. Water dripped from his coat, pooling in, the dirt of the barnyard. Clean, he looked no less scarred, but somehow more himself, like the truth had stepped forward once the disguises of filth were gone. Lily sat on a bale of straw, wiping sweat from her forehead, cheeks flushed with satisfaction. She tilted her head, studying him. "He needs a name." Clare tugged the brush through the stallion's mane. "Something strong." "What about Thunder?" Lily shook her head. "Too loud." "Midnight." "Too simple." Clare smirked faintly. "Well, I'm out of ideas." The girl slid off the bale and walked closer, staring into the stallion's eyes, black pools that reflected no end. "Shadow," she said softly, "because he's big and dark like a shadow that never leaves. Strong but quiet. You don't notice it until it's there, protecting you." The name hung in the air, and even Clare felt the shiver of rightness. She nodded. Shadowwood Island. The stallion shifted muscles, rippling, and gave a brief snort, as if in answer. Lily grinned. "See, he likes it." That afternoon, the sky glowed with heat, cicadas buzzing from the tree. Lily played in the yard with a skipping rope, while Clare mended a fence panel near the barn. Shadow dozed in the shade tail, swishing lazily, his limp still evident but less pronounced when he shifted his weight. The piece shattered with a violent crash. The old fence on the property's edge gave way with a splintering crack, boards scattering into the yard. Through the gap charged a massive bay stallion from the neighboring ranch. Broad-shouldered, nostrils, flared eyes. Wild. He was known in the area mean-tempered and poorly handled, often breaking into fights with other stock. He barreled forward with head-lowered hooves, tearing up clumps of grass. Lily Clare shouted, dropping her hammer. Her daughter had been standing just yards from the breach. She froze rope, slipping from her hands. Before Clare could reach her, Shadow was already moving. With a guttural snort, he surged upright, shaking off the long anger of the afternoon. Despite the limp, he planted himself squarely in front of the girl. His head dropped, low ears pinned flat, one hoof pawing the dirt. The sound that tore from his throat was not a whinny, but a warning deep and primal. The bay stallion skidded to a halt, foam flecking his lips. He struck the ground with his foreleg, snorting clouds of steam, eyes rolling white. For a long heartbeat, the two beasts locked stares, rain of tension heavy between them. Then, unexpectedly, the intruder faltered. He blew air hard through his nostrils, stamped once, then swung his massive head aside. With a final toss of his mane, he backed through the broken fence and trotted off, tail lashing. Lee's scream broke into gasping breaths. She darted forward, arms flinging around Shadow's scarred neck. "He saved me," she cried, voice muffled against his damp coat. "Mom, he saved me." Clare reached them seconds later, chest tight with both terror and awe. She pressed her hand against Shadow's flank, feeling the heat of his body, the steady tremor of adrenaline still coursing. His eyes burned with something fierce, something undeniable. She knelt to gather Lily close, but her gaze lingered on the stallion. He had no reason to protect them. He had every reason, after what people had done to him, to abandon or even lash out. And yet he had chosen to stand that night after Lily had been tucked into bed. Clare returned to the barn. The air was cool, sweet with hay. Shadow stood in his stall, head lowered, chewing slowly. She stepped close, resting a hand against the coarse mane. Her thoughts churned, colliding against each other. It was just instinct, she argued with herself. Any horse will fight when threatened. But the image of him standing between her daughter and danger, limping, scarred yet resolute, rose against that logic. Her chest tightened. She thought of her husband, of the stories his climbing partners told at it. The funeral, how he had gone back for a teammate in trouble, how he had placed another man's safety above his own. Clare closed her eyes. "You're not just any horse, are you?" she whispered, fingers tightening in his mane. "You know how to choose a side." The stallion flicked his ear back at the sound of her voice, then lowered his head until his muzzle brushed her shoulder. The gesture was small, almost tentative, but it steadied her more than she expected. For the first time since bringing him home, she didn't see a beast rescued out of pity. She saw an ally, a comrade. From that night on, Shadow was no longer just the stray they had taken in. Mitus, he was family. The wind shifted after midnight, cold and restless as it swept through the forest that pressed against the back of the Dawson property. Clouds moved across the sky, hiding and revealing the thin crescent moon in intervals. Pine trees moaned as their branches swayed, and somewhere far off, a lone coyote called its cry, carrying long across the ridges. Clare had only just drifted into sleep when a sound tugged her awake. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to cut through her dreams, the scrape of wood against metal, a low thud, and then the unmistakable rhythm of hooves pawing the ground. She sat up, every muscle taut. For a long moment she listened, straining past the thrum of wind. Then it came again. Throwing off the blanket, she pulled on her boots and padded softly down the hallway. Lily's door was closed, quiet inside. On the porch, the air met her like a cold hand. She flicked on the backlight. In the small corral near the barn, Shadow was awake and pacing. His enormous frame shifted restlessly, tail, lashing ears rigid. He stamped a hoof against the earth with such force that the sound carried across the yard. His nostrils flared breath, billowing in the white clouds that glimmered in the pale moonlight. "Easy," Clare whispered, stepping onto the porch. "What's wrong with you?" But the stallion wasn't listening. His head snapped toward her eyes, bright and urgent. He snorted, stomped again, then swung his head toward the dark line of trees behind the house. Clare's brow furrowed. "You want me to follow Shadow?" huffed ears pinned forward, gaze locked on the forest. It was more than restlessness. The energy coming off him was sharp, insistent, like a soldier demanding attention. Clare hesitated, instincts tugging in two directions. She could go back inside, lock the door, and pretend this was nothing, or she could trust him. With a muttered curse, under her breath, she reached for her jacket hanging on the porch rail. She shoved a flashlight into her pocket, slung the strap of her holster across her shoulder, and grabbed the old field notebook she carried out of habit. "All right," she whispered, voice low. "Show me." Shadow wheeled and moved toward the tree-lined muscles rolling beneath his scarred hide. Clare followed boots, sinking into damp earth as they left the safety of the yard. The forest swallowed them quickly. Shadow walked with surprising shitty, his limp barely noticeable as he threaded through the brush. His hooves made little sound on the pine needles, though Clare's boots cracked twigs and rustled the undergrowth. She lifted her flashlight, its thin beam swaying, cutting through patches of mist that clung to the ground. "Where are you taking me?" she muttered, though she knew no answer would come. Still, the stallion seemed to understand. He glanced back once, snorted, then pressed on, leading her along a narrow, game trail she'd never noticed before. The night pressed in thicker as they went. The forest grew dense branches, clawing at her jacket leaves, whispering secrets above her head. Somewhere an owl hooted, then silence. Fell an unnatural, sudden quiet. Even the insects stilled as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Clare's pulse quickened. She'd patrolled these ridges for years, knew every gully and ridge by daylight. But this was different. Shadow wasn't wandering. He was guiding. "How do you know this way?" she murmured, half to herself. The stallion didn't falter. His strides were purposeful, his ears never wavering. He carried himself as if he had walked this path 100 times before. Clare's grip tightened on her flashlight. She couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't leading him. He was leading her. It took nearly half an hour before the trees thinned and the ground leveled into a clearing. The beam of her flashlight caught the shape of a rusted iron gate leaning on its hinges. Tall grass grew in tufts through cracks in the packed earth. Above the gate, hanging crooked, was a paint sign so corroded by time and weather that the paint had bled away. Only one mark remained legible, clinging to the metal like a ghost. Lot 16. Clare's breath hitched. The stallion stopped, head high, ears rigid. He blew air hard through his nostrils, then tossed his head toward the gate. The smell hit her, then damp rot rust, and something darker like iron, soaked with age. She swung the flashlight beam across the yard. Low wooden sheds leaned dangerously, their roofs collapsed in places. The main barn crouched in the center, its tin roof pocked with holes that allowed narrow shafts of moonlight to pierce the dark. Shadow huffed, jerking his muzzle toward the door. "You've got to be kidding me," Clare muttered. But she stepped forward anyway, pushing against the warped wood of the gate. It groaned on its hinges, a hollow wail that seemed to ripple out into the trees. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. She swallowed hard and pushed through. The barn door sagged half open, one hinge hanging by a splinter of rust. When she laid her hand on it, the wood gave way with a screech. The sound echoed through the hollow space beyond. She flicked her flashlight upward and froze. Inside stretched a corridor lined with cages. They were iron-thick bars, once painted black, now eaten by rust. Doors hung ajar, some twisted out of shape, others still bolted shut. The air stank of mildew, urine, and old blood. Straw littered the ground, and clumps, blackened with mold. Clare stepped closer, the beam of her light trembling as it passed over the fawn floor. Here and there, dark stains spread in irregular patches, dried blood, old but undeniable. She swung the light higher. Chains still dangled from hooks on the beams, crusted with hair that clung like cobwebs. A leather strap, cracked and stiff, still hung from one. In the corner lay a rag, once cloth, now stiff with age, torn into ribbons, as though something had fought to pull free. The red blotches on it made her stomach turn. This wasn't a barn for sheltering livestock. It was a prison. Shadow didn't move. He stood behind her neck, arched nostrils, flaring eyes fixed on the rows of cages. His stillness spoke more than noise. He had seen this before. Clare's throat constricted. She forced herself to keep walking each step, crunching on straw and dirt. Near the back, she found a desk warped and sagging beneath years of damp. A drawer hung open. She tugged it farther, and the wood splintered in her hands. Inside, the papers were warped with water damage. The ink blurred into smudges. She thumbed carefully through the stack light, hovering. Most were unreadable, but one sheet stuck against the bottom bore a single line, still visible in green ink. Stable. X14. Hold for pickup. Her heart stumbled. That number, she knew it. Stable X14 had once been a legitimate facility years ago, before it went bankrupt and shuttered. It was supposed to be long gone, erased, from the registry. So, why was its name here, buried in this graveyard of cruelty? She folded the paper gently, slid it into her notebook. Her mind raced. Whoever had run this place had used the old license number as cover. It was clever on paper. It looked legal, while in reality, it was something far darker. Memories surfaced unbidden. She remembered nights at the precinct, hearing rumors passed in low voices. Mustangs vanishing from the plains, horse trailers without plates seen on. The highways at 2 inches the morning. Strangers with cash buying at auctions. No one tracked. At the time, it had all sounded like smoke without fire. No one could ever prove anything. By the time rangers checked the sites, the trucks were gone, the tracks erased by rains or wind. Locals had shrugged it off as gossip. But standing here staring at the rows of rusted cages, Claire knew the rumors had been true all along. She turned to Shadow. The stallion stood frozen, every line of him, tense ears flat, his chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. His eyes were dark, wide, reflecting the beam of her flashlight. But behind them was something deeper. Pain memory, the echo of survival. Her voice came low, trembling despite herself. "You've been here before, haven't you?" He didn't move, but the silence was answer enough. Claire stepped closer, laid a hand on his mane. His muscles quivered beneath her touch. "You're not just some lost horse," she whispered. "You're the witness. You know what happened here." The realization settled like stone in her chest. Shadow wasn't a chance encounter. He hadn't simply wandered into town. He had returned. He had brought her here for a reason. Claire closed her notebook, tucking it away. She leaned closer, her lips near at his ear. "I promise," she said, voice steady. "Now, I'll find the truth. Whatever they did here, whoever did it, I'll bring it to light." Outside, the clouds shifted and the crescent moon slid free. Light poured through the holes in the barn roof, falling across the woman and the stallion, standing together among the ruins. One human, one horse, both scarred, both unwilling to let silence have the last word. The forest still held the weight of the secret they had uncovered at Lot 16. Though a few days had passed since Claire and Shadow had stood among those rusting cages, the image haunted her when she closed her eyes at night. The stains on the straw, the chains still dangling, the memory burning in Shadow's tense stillness. But duty had a way of pressing forward, regardless of grief. The morning broke crisp and thin sunlight slanting across ridges still, crowned in mist. A low wind carried the resin scent of pine and the sharp chill of snowmelt. Streams. Claire tightened the cinch on her saddle, listening to the leather creak under her hands. Today's assignment was routine patrol along the forest edge, the kind of work that kept her grounded. Shadow stamped a hoof beside her. He had grown stronger in the days since his arrival, his coat glossier, his muscles filling in again. She hadn't planned on taking him out, but something in his restless energy that morning made the decision for her. A ride would stretch. His legs remind him what it meant to move forward. "Let's see what you've got," she murmured, patting his neck. What she didn't see, what she never expected, was the small shadow trailing her down the lane a few minutes later. Lily had woken early, too. She had watched her mother tack up Shadow through the window, excitement sparking in her chest. She knew she wasn't supposed to follow. Patrol was serious work, but curiosity. It was a force stronger than caution for a child. She wheeled her little bike onto the gravel road, keeping far enough back that Claire wouldn't notice pedals crunching softly as she slipped into the veil of trees. The trail wound narrow between the pines, cutting close to a ridge where the rock face dropped into a shallow ravine. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Here the air damp and cool mist curling. In pockets where the earth sank, Shadow moved with alert precision, ears flicking hooves careful. Claire sat tall in the saddle, scanning the ridges out of habit. This stretch of forest was usually quiet, an occasional mule deer, maybe the distant drumming of a growl. But today, as they rounded a bend, Shadow stiffened. He halted mid-step, the muscles taut beneath her. His head swung toward the ravine nostrils, flaring ears pinned sharp. Claire frowned. "What is it?" The answer came in a sound so faint she almost missed it. A broken whimper, like breath catching, followed by the thin note of pain. Not quite a whinny, not quite a cry. From behind, Lily had heard it too. She braked her bike hard, heart hammering. She pushed through a cluster of brush, ignoring the scratch of branches against Dianammer. Her arms. And then she saw it. Nestled awkwardly against the rocks at the base of the ravine lay a foe no more than a few months old. Its coat should have shown golden brown, but hunger had dulled it to patchy roughness. Its belly was gaunt, ribs etched stark beneath the skin. Legs folded beneath it trembled from weakness. One flank bore a long scrape, the blood-dried dark fur clotted around it. Its eyes, wide and terrified, stared at the world with a hollow gaze of something abandoned. Lily gasped. "Mom, look down there." Claire swung out of the saddle the moment she saw the shape below. She scrambled down the slope boots, skidding on loose gravel until she reached the small body. She dropped to, her knees flashlight from her pack, flicking across its frame. The foe's breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of its chest labored. She pressed a hand to its side. The heartbeat was faint, fluttering like a trapped bird. Its lips were dry, cracked from thirst. Every sign told her the truth. It had been separated from its mother for days. Claire's stomach tightened. Survival odds for an abandoned foe were slim, even in the best conditions. And this was far from ideal. She drew a steadying breath. It won't make it. Not out here. And we can't take on another mom. Number Lily had slid down the rocks behind her cheeks, flushed hair falling into her eyes. Tears glistened there as she shook her head violently. She grabbed Claire's sleeve with desperate force. "We can't leave it here. Please, please, Mom, we have to help." Her voice cracked, trembling with the kind of certainty only children carried the refusal to accept that mercy had limits. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it. Logic screamed against the plea, the resources, the risk, the heartbreak. Yet staring at her daughter, she saw the same raw compassion that had driven her to pull Shadow from the corner of Main Street. The same compassion Claire herself had once carried before loss taught her. Caution. Her chest ached. She didn't answer. Before she could, Lily had already shrugged off her jacket. She spread it across the foe's back with trembling hands, wrapping the thin body like it was porcelain. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're not going to be left behind anymore. I promise." The foe twitched, flinched at the touch, then sagged into the warmth of the jacket. Its head wobbled unsteadily, until it found her shoulder. There, it rested light as a feather, heavy as a vow. Claire froze, breath caught. The sight pierced her. For an instant, she was transported backward in time to a memory she hadn't visited in years. A younger version of herself standing in a muddy yard, tugging at her father's arm, begging him not to leave a stray pup behind. The same pleading eyes, the same stubborn love. History was repeating itself, and Claire had no power to stop it. The crunch of hooves drew her gaze. Shadow had moved closer. He loomed over the massive frame, blotting out the pale sunlight. His head lowered slowly until his muzzle hovered above the foe. For a moment, Claire stiffened, wary of how a stallion might react to weakness. But then, Shadow exhaled a deep and deliberate breath and touched his nose gently against the foe's neck. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Not curiosity, not accident, recognition. The foe lifted its head ears, twitching uncertainly. Then, in a sound barely audible, it wickered a soft, fragile greeting. Claire's throat tightened. Shadow answered with a rumble deep in his chest, a sound she had never heard from him before. It was protective grounding, as though he had claimed the little one on the spot. "God," Claire whispered, "you're guarding it." She swallowed hard, watching them. The scarred stallion and the trembling foe, the bond forming in silence. It wasn't chance. It wasn't instinct alone. It was something deeper, as if Shadow had recognized himself in the small creature's suffering. They managed to coax the foal to its feet with gentle urgings, Claire steadying its flank while Lily whispered encouragements. It stumbled, nearly falling, but Shadow pressed his shoulder close, steadying it with his bulk. By the time they reached the trail, Lily had clambered onto Shadow's back, the fold tucked against his side jacket, still clinging loosely around its ribs. The ride home was slow, careful. Halfway there, Lily leaned down, speaking softly into Shadow's ear, but meaning the words for the foe. "You need a name, something strong enough to keep you here." She paused, lips curling in thought. "Midnight, because I found you in the dark. But you're a little light for us, too." Claire heard her and felt something stir in her chest. Midnight. It suited the tiny creature, fragile yet luminous in its will to cling to life. She glanced at Shadow. He turned his head briefly toward the foe, then back forward as if in silent agreement. Back at the Dawson home, the barn took on a new shape. Clare scattered fresh straw thickly across the stall floor, the sweet scent filling the air. She set a bucket of water near the corner and warmed milk substitute on the stove, carrying it back carefully. Midnight collapsed onto the bedding, almost at once, legs folding neatly as exhaustion overtook it. Shadow positioned himself near the stall door, head just inside, body blocking the entrance. His ears flicked at every noise, his gaze unblinking. It was clear he would not be moved. Lily sat cross-legged on the straw, her small hand stroking the foe's neck in slow, steady motions. Midnight's breathing was shallow but steadier now, lulled by the presence. Surrounding it, her eyes shone damp but bright, full of the kind of hope that refused to dim. Clare stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame, watching them all. The scarred stallion, the fragile foe, little girl with her hand resting like a vow. She felt something loosen inside her, a recognition she couldn't shake. This wasn't just about one horse or two. It was bigger, deeper, like they had been drawn into a story unfolding long before they stepped into it. Her whisper was meant for herself, but Shadow's ears twitched at the words. We've stepped into something larger than us, haven't we? The barn creaked softly, the night settling. Shadow didn't move. Midnight sighed, curling deeper into the straw, and Lily's voice carried soft as prayer. You're safe now. You're home. The days that followed the rescue of Midnight blurred together in a rhythm that was both tender and uneasy. The foe clung to life in the Dawson barn, gaining strength slowly under Lily's watchful care. Shadow remained close at all hours, his looming form standing guard as if the barn were a fortress. And though Clare tended to the animals with steady hands, her mind was elsewhere, turning again and again to the ruins of Lot 16 and the meaning of that waterlogged note, Stable X14, hold for pickup. Late into the nights, she sat at the kitchen table, maps of the valley spread before her notes, filling the margins of her notebook. Patterns began to emerge the longer she studied. The game trails she'd followed, near the ravine where they found Midnight, matched too neatly with older hoof tracks she'd noted months ago. They seemed to converge toward the east to a sector near the abandoned quarry, a place that had once supplied gravel, before the trucks moved on and left only scars in the earth. Her pencil hovered over the map. Shadow shifted uneasily when she traced that area. Each time she led him east on patrol, his muscles tightened, his ears pinned. He pawed the ground, nostrils flaring as though he remembered something she couldn't yet see. Clare tapped the map with the end of her pencil. That's where they're keeping them, she muttered to herself, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. She went alone. It was near dusk when she saddled Shadow, though she left him behind at the barn once she reached the far trail. Tonight, she needed quiet, not the thunder of hooves to give her away. Armed with her field pack, a flashlight, her battered notebook, and the small handheld camera issued to her for documenting illegal sites, she set out on foot. The forest thickened as the trail sloped downward, the air damp with moss and rich earth. Clare moved slowly, crouching low when the sound of water reached her ears. A creek spilling over stones, cutting a line toward the old quarry. There, hidden by the pines, she saw it. A rough fence had been erected from timber, stripped hastily the posts. Crooked wire looped between them. Beyond, it glowed the faint flicker of lantern light, yellow and wavering in the evening haze. She crouched, heart hammering. The sounds carried next the thin broken whinnies of horses. Not the proud cries of free mustangs, but the strained hollow calls of animals penned too long. Metal clinked, faintly chains rattling against bars. The smell followed the heavy stench of manure left to rot, sweat, and rust, mingled until the air was thick enough to choke. Clare pressed the camera to her eye, snapping quick photos through the branches, the fence, the light, the shadowed shapes of trailers with their beds covered by tarps. Tire tracks still shone with mud, damp and fresh. This wasn't a relic of the past. It was running right now. Her throat tightened. Proof. This was proof. She scribbled notes with a shaking hand, forcing herself to capture every detail. She was so focused, she almost didn't hear the voice behind her. Lost your way, Ranger. Claire's spun hand flying to her sidearm. The man standing only a few feet away smiled lazily, as if they were two acquaintances meeting on a porch rather than in the shadows of a criminal camp. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered leather jacket that hung open to reveal a dark shirt beneath. His eyes were narrow, calculating the kind that missed nothing. His smile was thin and sharp, cutting, his face into something wolfish. Vince Mallory. Claire said the name, leaving her lips like a curse. The smirk widened. Ah, so you've heard of me. Flanking him were two others. The first was tall and angular, bones jutting through skin stretched too thin. His face was hollow, his grin missing more than one tooth. He tapped an iron bar against his palm with steady rhythm. Clang, 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 the sound carrying like a warning bell. Clem Raleigh. She recognized a petty thug known for trouble in the saloons. The second was silent, a wall of muscle with arms thick as fence posts. He didn't speak, only cracked his knuckles deliberately, one after the other, eyes dead and steady. Luke Harper, a man with a reputation for settling debts with his fists. Claire's pulse raced, 3 against 1. Vince strolled closer, boots crunching softly in the dirt. He gestured lazily toward the glow of the compound. You see wild horses? People like to pretend they're symbols. Freedom, beauty, all that nonsense. But to me, his voice was smooth, almost conversational. They're money, nothing more. Claire's jaw clenched. They're living creatures. What you're doing is a crime. Crime? Vince chuckled, tilting his head. No, sweetheart. Crime is what gets you locked up. This, he swept his arm toward the camp. This is business. Claw's voice was steady, though her hand hovered close to her radio. I've seen enough. I'll be back with a warrant. Vince laughed, the sound low and unpleasant. He stepped closer until she could smell the faint tang of tobacco on his jacket. Oh, I'm sure you will, but here's the thing. His eyes narrowed. You've got a little girl, don't you? Claire froze, his smile stretched, cruel and deliberate. Blonde hair, always tagging along. Cute kid, be a shame if someone scared her. Clem snorted, tossing the iron bar into the dirt with a loud thud. Dust puffed up around his boots. Luke only cracked his neck to one side, eyes glinting with silent malice. The message was clear. Claire forced herself not to flinch. She locked eyes with Vince, voice cutting, threatening a federal officer won't save. You're digging your own grave. He shrugged, that infuriating half-smile. Never slipping, maybe. But graves come in all sizes, Ranger. Some are smaller than others. Her hand tightened on the notebook at her side, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at her to draw to fight, but 3 against 1, with her daughter's name hanging in the air. This wasn't the time. She began to step back, slow and controlled. Her voice dropped into something iron. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. I'll be back, and next time you won't see me coming. Vince lifted his brows as if amused, then gave a mock salute. We'll be waiting. Clem chuckled under his breath. Luke said nothing. Claire didn't turn her back until she was far enough down the trail, the trees closing behind her. Only then did she quicken her pace, boots thudding against the earth, her breath sharp in her throat. The echo of his words gnawed at her as fiercely as the fear itself. Blonde hair, cute kid. He hadn't just guessed. He knew Lily. They'd been watching. Her pulse roared. By the time she reached the edge of town, twilight had deepened to night. She rode the last stretch home with her, jaw clenched, every muscle coiled tight. When the house came into view, the porch light spilling across the yard, she saw them. Lily knelt in the grass, laughter bubbling as midnight tried awkwardly to nibble at her shoelaces. Shadow stood nearby, as immovable as stone, eyes always watchful. The sight should have eased her. Instead, it only sharpened the terror in her chest. She dismounted quickly, her boots striking the ground with force. For a long moment, she stood there, fists curling at her sides, staring at her daughter, framed in the golden light. Mom, Lily called, smiling, oblivious. Claire swallowed hard. She forced her, voice steady. Inside soon, Lily, it's late. As her daughter obeyed, Claire let her gaze drift to shadow. The stallion's eyes caught hers across the yard, dark and knowing. She whispered so low, only the night could hear, I have to end this. Before they ever get close to her, the vow settled like steel inside, her heavier than any badge she wore. The morning after her confrontation with Vince Mallory broke gray and uncertain. Light, barely breaking through the low clouds, clinging to the valley. Claire sat stiff-backed in the sheriff's office, her notebook open on the desk between her and Sheriff Tom Radcliffe. He was a broad man in his 50s, hair thinning at the temples, his voice always steady as though nothing in the world could rattle him. He listened quietly as Claire recounted the night before. The glow of lanterns, behind the fence, the rattling chains, the threats Vince had hissed into the dark. She slid the camera across the table, photos flicking past grainy glimpses of tarp trailers, silhouettes of horses behind wire. Radcliffe studied them jaw tight. Then he shook his head. "It's not enough," he said simply. "Too far, too dark." The defense lawyer would laugh this out of court. Clare exhaled sharply, frustration rising. "You know they're there. You've heard the rumors for years." "I know." His gaze met hers unwavering. "And I believe you. But believing doesn't sign a warrant. Bring me proof, Clare's solid proof, and I'll bring you the paper and the men to back it." The words fell like stone. Law without. Evidence was no weapon at all. She gathered her notes, slid them back into her pack. "Then, I'll get you. Proof," she said, voice low. "Whatever it takes." Radcliffe gave a slow nod, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Be careful, Dawson. Mallory's not the kind to bluff, if he says he knows your daughter." "I know," Clare cut in her throat tight. She didn't need the reminder. By late afternoon, the sky itself seemed to share her unease. The wind funneled down the valley in long groaning gusts, carrying with it the scent of rain and resin torn from the trees. Dark clouds thickened over the mountains, piling higher and higher, their underbellies bruised purple. Lightning flickered silently along the ridges, followed by the rolling growl of thunder that chased across the basin. Clare stood on the porch, arms folded across her chest, watching the storm swallow the sky. It felt like a reflection of her own chest, something heavy building pressure she could no longer contain. Shadow stood tethered near the barn, restless. His ears flicked at every rumble, his hooves shifting as though he too sensed what was coming. Midnight pressed against his side, the foe's smaller frame trembling. Lily crouched beside them, whispering, soft reassurances neither animal nor storm could quite absorb. When the first fat drops of rain struck the dust, Clare turned away. It was time. She found Elena Cruz at the ranger substation. The younger ranger was already rolling up maps, her dark braid damp from the drizzle. Elena was quick and sharp, known for her uncanny ability to follow tracks where others saw only dirt. "You heard?" Clare asked. Elena's eyes lit with determination. "Word's gone around. Half the town whispers Mallory's name, but no one dares step forward. If you're moving, I'm with you. No hesitation. None." Elena slung her pack over her shoulder. "If we can take down a ring that's been bleeding this valley dry, I won't miss the chance." Later in the sheriff's, Radcliffe was waiting, raincoat slung over his chair, shotgun leaning by the door. He looked tired but resolute. "I'll come myself," he said. "Not sending deputies blind into this. We'll move. Tonight. The storm will cover us, hide our approach." They laid out the plan over a damp map, spread across his desk. 3 angles, Clare and Shadow from the front, Elena circling wide to cut the side fence. Radcliffe closing off the trail behind to block escape. Swift, coordinated, clean. Clare tapped the paper. "No mistakes. Once we go in, they'll fight. Like cornered wolves." Radcliffe only grunted. "I've cornered wolves before." Back home, she packed in silence. Flashlight cuffs, extra radio batteries, a camera again. Her badge weighed heavier than usual on her chest. She laid her service revolver on the table, cleaned it, checked each round, slid it back into its holster. She was strapping on her belt when she sensed eyes on her. Lily stood in the doorway, small hands, gripping the frame. Her face was pale, but her chin lifted with a kind of determination that mirrored her. "Mothers, take me with you," she whispered. Clare froze. "Lily, no, absolutely not." Her daughter stepped forward, voice trembling but insistent. "I'll stay in the car, I promise. I won't move, I won't make a sound. Just don't leave me here." Claire's throat tightened. "This isn't a game. It's dangerous. If something happens..." Tears welled in Lily's eyes, but she held her the ground. "I know it's dangerous, but if I stay here alone, I'll be more scared. At least if I'm close, I'll know you're there. And Shadow's there." She wiped at her cheeks quickly. "I trust you, and I trust him." Shadow, as if summoned, appeared at the edge of the porch, his silhouette dark against the flickering sky. He stood silent, watchful. Claire's chest burned. She looked between them, her child and the stallion, both staring back with unspoken faith. She felt the split down her spine, mother and ranger, protector and officer. She wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to lock Lily safe inside the house and face the storm, alone. But Vince's words echoed in her skull blonde hair. "Cute kid." Mallory already knew. There was no safety in distance now. Minutes passed in silence until Clare knelt, resting her hands on Lily's shoulders. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "All right," she said softly. "You can come, but you stay in the car, no matter what. No stepping out until I tell you. Swear it." Lily's tears spilled in relief. She flung her arms around her mother's neck. "I swear." Clare closed her eyes, holding her tight. Shadow gave a low, rumbling nicker as if punctuating the vow. By nightfall, the storm had fully arrived. Rain hissed against the windows, pelting, and the earth in sheets. Thunder cracked across the valley with bones shaking force, and the wind tore through the pines until they groaned like timbers straining against collapse. In the driveway, Radcliffe's cruiser pulled up, headlights smeared by the downpour. Elena arrived moments later on her ATV poncho, plastered to her frame, eyes glinting with determination beneath her hood. They huddled under the porch awning, checking and rechecking gear. Radios clicked, flashlights blinked red through waterproof sleeves. Radcliffe loaded shells with slow precision, while Elena tugged the press, laces tight on her boots. Clare saddled Shadow one last time. The stallion stood calm despite the storm, as though he'd been waiting for this night. She pressed her forehead briefly against his neck, inhaling the scent of rain in his coat. Behind her, through the glass, Lily sat in the car with Midnight curled in a blanket beside her. The child's hands clutched her jacket tight to her chest. Her wide eyes never left Shadow's silhouette, as though drawing courage from his presence. The three adults exchanged a final look. Words weren't needed. They all understood what was at stake, what it would mean if they failed. Radcliffe adjusted his hat, voice steady, even against the thunder. "Let's move." Clare mounted Shadow. Elena melted into the trees, and the storm swallowed them whole. The hunt had begun. Clare leaned low against Shadow's neck, water streaming down her face, her jacket heavy and cold. Elena and Radcliffe moved in the silence behind her, their shapes blurred and by the curtain of rain. Behind them, further down the road, Lily sat in the parked vehicle, forehead pressed to the glass. Her breath fogged the window. Her small hands clutched her jacket to her chest. Each rumble of thunder made her heart leap, but she refused to look away. She could see her mother's silhouette and Shadow's towering form through the downpour, and she clung to that sight, like an anchor. The storm worked in their favor. The roar of rain drowned the sound of footsteps, the crack of branches. Wind ripped through the trees and tore, taking away their scent. They were ghosts in the tempest. Clare raised her hand, halting the group just beyond the fence. The glow of lanterns lit the compound in sickly yellow shadows, twisting across rows of rusted pens. Horses shifted, restlessly inside thin bodies, pressing against the bars, eyes wide and rolling white with fear. The smell hit them, first. Stale manure, wet, hide the acrid sting of rust and blood. Clare's chest tightened. She'd seen wounded animals before, but never like this. They weren't just neglected. They were broken down to shadows of what they should have been. Yet even now some lifted their heads, ears, twitching nostrils, flaring at the scent of rain and freedom so close. She turned to Radcliffe and Elena, her jaw tight. "We start with the closest pens. Move fast, quiet. We don't know. How many are inside?" Both nodded. Radcliffe pulled a crowbar from his belt. Selina unsheathed her bolt cutters. The storm raged on above as they went to work. The first lock snapped with a metallic crack. The gate swung open and Clare stepped inside, moving slow so as not to startle the trembling mare within. She laid a hand on its neck, whispering over the sound of rain. "Easy, you're safe now. We've got you." The mare's shivered ribs jutting under her slick coat, but when Clare guided her out, she stumbled into the storm, lifted her head, and released a thin, cracked whinny. Another horse answered from the next pen. One by one, the gates opened. Some horses collapsed the moment they were free, legs quivering from exhaustion. Others pawed at the mud, nostrils flaring as if daring the storm to challenge them. For each, Clare and Elena coaxed them forward, guiding them into the clearing. The noise grew, a chorus of desperate whinnies, the clang of chains falling. Away, the frantic stomp of hooves meeting mud for the first time in weeks. It was chaos, but it was hope made sound. Clare had just reached the next pen when a roar split through the storm, closer and sharper than thunder. "Caught you, Ranger!" Clem Raleigh burst from the shadows, iron rod in his hands. His face twisted in fury, teeth flashing in the lightning. He swung hard the bar, whistling through the air. Clare turned too late, but Shadow moved first. The stallion erupted with a roar of his own, a sound so primal it cut through rain and storm alike. He lunged, massive body slamming into Clem's chest with crushing force. The thug flew backward into the mud, the rod spinning from his grasp. Clem gasped, struggling, spitting water and blood. He scrambled for his weapon, but Shadow was already there, ears pinned flat, eyes burning. He stomped the earth, mud sprang, daring him to rise. Radcliffe leveled his gun, but Clare lifted her hand sharply. No, let Shadow handle him. For a long heartbeat, Clem stared into the stallion's blazing eyes. Lightning carved the scene in white, the scarred horse standing over him. Water streaming from his black hide, every muscle taut with fury. Clem's bravado cracked. He staggered back a step, slipping in the mud, but hatred lingered in his gaze. Inside the car, Lily's eyes widened at the sudden flash of violence. She pressed closer to the window, searching for her mother through the plush. Storm. And then she saw it farther back, nearly hidden by the sagging wall of the compound. A smaller pen half collapsed. Lightning illuminated it just long enough for her to see what lay inside. A mare, old and gray, her coat caked with filth and blood. She was crumpled in the corner flanks, heaving eyes dull and lifeless. One side of her body was slick with crimson, where a deep gash tore through her flesh. Lily's breath caught. Number. Before she could think, her hand was on the latch. The car door banged open, rain slamming against her. She ran, shoes sinking in, mud hair plastered to her face. Lily Claw's shout tore through the storm, but the wind swallowed it. The girl skidded to her knees before the pen fingers trembling as she fought with the rusted lock. It's okay. Don't give up, she whispered through chattering teeth. I'll call you Hope. You just have to hold on. The mayor stirred weakly, one ear twitching. When her gaze met Lily's, something flickered there. Faint but real. The ember of life. Refusing to go out, behind her, Clem's eyes narrowed. His lips twisted into a snarl. Well, would you look at that? He rasped. Perfect. Timing. He dragged a knife from his belt at the blade gleaming in the lightning. Mud clung to his face, rage twisting every line. Claire's heart stopped. No! She... but screamed, lunging forward. But the distance was too great. The mud, too thick. Clem raised the knife eyes locked on the small girl before him. Shadow thundered forward. He came like a black bolt, hooves tearing mud, bodies slamming, into Clem with bone-rattling force. The man's scream was lost to the storm, as the knife flew from his hand and clattered into the muck. Clem crumpled, wheezing blood streaking down his jaw. Shadow planted himself between him and Lily, massive chest heaving, ears pinned, teeth bared. Rain streamed down his scars, his eyes fire-bright. Lily clung to the mayor, trembling, but refusing to let go. It's okay, Hope, she whispered, voice breaking. We're safe. He won't hurt us. Clem tried to rise, but Radcliffe and Elena were already there, pinning him hard into the mud. Radcliffe snapped cuffs around his wrists, yanking him upright. You're done, the sheriff growled. Claire fell to her knees beside Lily, dragging her into her arms. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She wanted to scold, to scream, but relief broke through first. She held her daughter tight, whispering fiercely, Don't you ever scare me like that again. Lily sobbed against her chest, but clung just as tightly. The commotion had roused the rest of the camp. Voices shouted from the main tent. Vince Mallory appeared, his face pale in the lantern glow. He took one look at Clem, restrained in the mud, then spun without hesitation. Stop him, Elena cried. But Vince was already running, coat whipping behind him, feet pounding through the storm. He vanished into the tree like smoke swallowed by the wind. Elena darted after him, flashlight beam cutting through rain. Radcliffe peeled away in the opposite direction, circling wide to block the trail. Claire stayed rooted by her daughter's side, unwilling to leave her again. Branches lashed Elena's arms as she chased the fugitive. Mud sucked at her boots. Lightning blinded her, but she pressed on, teeth gritted. Vince's shadow bobbed ahead, slipping, recovering, cutting through brush like a cornered animal. He burst into a clearing, only to meet the blaze of Radcliffe's red-filtered light. Stop right there, Mallory, the sheriff bellowed. Vince drew a blade, lunging, but Elena fired her taser in the same instant. The prong snapped against his jacket, electricity arcing. Vince convulsed, screaming as his body crashed into the mud. Radcliffe was on him in seconds, wrenching the knife away, snapping cuffs onto his wrists. The man writhed, gasping, but the fight was over. By the time they dragged Vince back to the compound, the storm was breaking. The rain eased to a steady drizzle, thunder rolling away across the ridges. The last of the pens stood open. The freed horses milled in the clearing, stamping and calling to one another. their cries echoing through the night. For the first time, they were not cries of despair, but of life reclaimed. Shadow stood with his head-high chest, rising and falling with exhaustion, his body trembling from effort but unbowed. He pressed close to Lily and hoped the old mare, who now leaned against him, still bleeding but alive. Clare knelt, brushing wet hair from her daughter's face. "I told you to stay in the car," she said softly, exhaustion roughening her voice. Lily sniffled, eyes glistening, "But I saved her." She glanced at the gray mare, then back at her mother. "I couldn't just sit there." Claire's throat tightened. She pulled her close, whispering, "You're just like your father." Nearby, Elena wiped rain from her brow, reporting to Radcliffe. "The compound's clear, no one left standing." The sheriff surveyed the muddy chaos, Clem groaning in chains. Vince collapsed between two deputies, the freed herd stamping the earth. He exhaled slowly, a long breath of relief. "It's over," he said. Clare wasn't so sure. She lifted her gaze to the thinning clouds. The moon peeked through at last, pale light spilling across the drenched clearing. Mud, blood, and rain glistened like silver. Her muscles shook with fatigue, but her eyes burned with something fiercer than exhaustion. Vince Mallory and his men were hauled into the county jail that morning, and their boots leaving muddy tracks along the station floor. The chaos of the night had ended, but the echoes of shouting of hooves striking against metal still rang in Clare Dawson's ears. In the interrogation room, Vince sat cuffed to the table, his soaked leather jacket dripping onto the concrete. He leaned back in his chair, eyes hooded, mouth twisted in that same smug grin he'd worn in the woods. "You think you've done something noble?" he drawled, voice hoarse from shouting. "You think cutting a few locks makes you a hero?" Clare stood on the opposite side of the table, arms folded, her ranger's badge glinting under the fluorescent light. Sheriff Radcliffe sat beside her pen, poised, his expression unreadable. A thick file of photographs lay on the table, images of the cages, the chains, the horses collapsing in mud, proof undeniable and final. "You're finished," Vince Radcliffe said calmly. "We've got enough here to bury you 10 years deep, maybe more. The only choice you've got left is how much you want to talk." Vince's grin faltered. His eyes flicked to Clare, then back to the file. For a long moment, he said nothing. The storm outside replaced by the storm inside the small room. Finally, he exhaled, leaning forward. "That black beast of yours," he said slowly, "you think he's some miracle? You think he came walking out of the wilderness all noble and wild? He's not. He's mine. Was mine." Claire's jaw clenched. "Shadow isn't yours." Vince smirked. "Shadow. Cute name. Back then, we called him Titan. Biggest horse we ever had. Strong as a bull, mean as a cornered wolf. He was bred for the pits." Radcliffe's brows furrowed. The pits, Vince's grin widened. "Ugly fights. You know how folks pay for fights. Dog fights, same thing, only bigger, bloodier. We'd set him against other stallions, broken broncs, anything worth a bet. People came from 3 counties to watch him crush the others. Money poured in. He made us a fortune." Claire's stomach turned. She imagined Shadows scarred, limping, silent, forced to clash again and again for the amusement of men like Vince. "What happened?" Radcliffe pressed. Vince shrugged, his tone flippant. "He got hurt. Back leg went bad in one fight. Couldn't earn any more. So I told Briggs to get rid of him. Didn't care how. Just wanted him gone. Guess the old drunk dragged him to town and slapped a sign on him. $5. For the beast. That's all he was worth in the end." Claire's hands curled into fists. She wanted to leap across the table to wipe the smirk from his face, but she forced herself still. In Vince's eyes, Shadow had been a tool, disposable when broken. Yet, in her mind, in Lily's eyes, Shadow was so much more. A survivor, a warrior who had stood between her daughter and death. "You're wrong," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the room. "He wasn't a beast. He wasn't trash. He's stronger than you'll ever be. And when people remember this story, they won't remember your name, Vince. They'll remember his." For the first time, Vince looked unsettled. The trial would come later. For now, Clare focused on the living. Shadow, Midnight, and dozens of other horses were relocated temporarily to holding stables. But the county couldn't keep them forever, and Clare knew she couldn't take care of all of them alone. The burden pressed on her shoulders until one evening, as she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by Lily's crayons and school books, her daughter slid a notebook across to her. On the cover page was a single sentence written in Lily's messy hand. "Haven for Hooves." Clare blinked. "What's this?" Lily leaned forward, eyes shining. A place for them, for Shadow, for Midnight, for all the others. Not just to survive, but to be safe. We could build it, Mama, right here. Claire stared at the words. The name felt simple, childlike, but also right. A haven, a place where Hooves could find peace again. When she told Sheriff Radcliffe and Elena Cruz the next day, they both nodded. You'll need help, Radcliffe said. Then we'll ask for it, Claire replied. News spread quickly. At first, people came out of curiosity, drawn by whispers of the raid of the scarred stallion that had saved a child in the storm. But soon, curiosity turned into commitment. A local carpenter showed up with his toolbox and built sturdy new stalls. The owner of the feed store dropped off bales of hay and sacks of oats. The veterinarian offered discounted care, shaking his head in disbelief at the cruelty the animals had endured. Children arrived with jars of coins they'd saved from allowances, proudly handing them over as if they were gold. Even Mrs. Rowley, the sharp-tongued widow from next door, who had once scolded Lily for trampling her garden, began, stopping by with baskets of biscuits and fresh apples. She patted Shadow's neck with uncharacteristic gentleness. My husband worked with search and rescue horses back in his day, she murmured. He'd be proud to see this. Day by day, the barren yard behind Claire's house transformed. The sagging, old barn was repaired and painted. New fences rose, enclosing green pasture. A sign appeared above the entrance, carved by hand, but painted carefully by Lily Haven for Hooves, Hope the Old Gray. Mare Lily had named healed slowly under their care. Her ribs smoothed, her eyes brightened. And though her limp never fully faded, she regained a dignity that had long been stolen. One afternoon, a kind farming couple arrived. Their own horse had died the year before, and when they saw Hope, their eyes softened. She belongs with us, woman said, tears brimming. It was hard for Lily to let go. She pressed, her cheek against Hope's scarred neck, whispering, Your name will always mean hope. When the mayor nickered softly, as though understanding, Lily smiled through her tears. Midnight, however, never strayed from Lily's side. The foe followed her everywhere into the fields, along the creek, even trying to nose his way into the kitchen once. Claire only shook her head and laughed. He's chosen you, she told her daughter. And Lily grinned, certain Midnight would be her companion for life. Shadow had taken a different place. His limp never faded, a scar carved into his body like a story that could not be erased. Yet he wore it with dignity. No longer a fighter in pits, no longer a beast wagered upon, he became something greater, a guardian of haven for Hooves. Children called him the Night Watchman. At dusk, his massive silhouette patrolled the fence line. When a fox crept too close, he thundered after it. When strangers lingered at the gate, he stood like a sentinel until Claire appeared. Scarred, silent, unwavering, Shadow had become the heart of the refuge. Claire often watched from the porch, the sun melting into the ridges. She'd see Lily run to him, the stallion lowering his head, gentle enough for a child's hand to brush his scarred muzzle. In Shadow, she no longer saw just survival. She saw redemption, transformation. One golden afternoon, Lily sat sketching on the porch steps, her small hands flying across paper with colored pencils. When she held up the drawing, Claire's breath caught. The sketch showed a house, a barn, wide open fields. She and Lily stood side by side, their hands linked, surrounded by horses. Midnight galloped in the background, but towering above them all was Shadow, drawn larger than life, his eyes glowing like embers in the dusk. Claire pulled her daughter close. For the first time in years, warmth bloomed where grief had hollowed her. That evening she carried a plaque to the barn, rough-hewn, hand-carved, the letters cut deep, Valor. She hung it above Shadow's stall, pressing her forehead to his dark coat. You're not just a survivor, she whispered. You're our protector. Shadow nudged her shoulder softly, as if he understood. The valley exhaled. Laughter replaced hammering. Children brushed horses, neighbors gathered, broken lives began to heal. The refuge thrived. But one evening, as the sun bled red across the Tetons, the stillness fractured. Midnight froze, mid-gallop, ears pricked. Shadow's head snapped toward the ridgeline. His body stiffened, every muscle alert. A low, guttural rumble escaped his chest, the sound of a sentinel who sensed something unseen. Claire followed his gaze. A dark figure lingered on the ridge, watching the pasture. Too far to recognize, too still to be casual. Her heart stuttered. The past, she realized, never stayed buried for long. Lily laughed behind her, chasing Midnight through the grass, unaware of the shadow stretching across the valley. Claire's hand closed around the porch rail, her jaw tightening. Healing had given them peace, but peace, she knew, was only ever borrowed. And in that moment, she understood. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning.